Mark Wahlberg takes on the bullies at the grocery store to help a single mom. The fluorescent lights hummed dully above the wide aisles of Parkside Grocers as Mark Wahlberg, dressed inconspicuously in a worn baseball cap and simple white t-shirt, stepped inside hoping to grab a quick dinner for himself before an evening of memorizing lines for his next film, unaware that fate would soon alter his mundane routine in the most unexpected way. He pushed a squeaky-wheeled cart past towers of canned goods and shelves of fresh produce, occasionally stopping to greet passers-by who recognized him with a double-take, yet remained too polite to bother him for an autograph. The store wasn't particularly crowded, and the faint echo of an argument at the far end of the produce section barely registered in his mind at first. But as the voices rose in both volume and aggression, he couldn't help but take notice. Following the noise, he spotted a weary-looking single mother named Sarah, her tangled hair tied up hastily with a hairband, her clothes disheveled and her eyes rimmed with fatigue, clutching a small shopping list and a near-empty wallet. She was reaching for a can of baby formula, her hands trembling slightly, when a group of 3 imposing figures stepped in front of her cart, blocking her path with disdainful expressions. Normally Mark would assume they were simply in the wrong spot at the wrong time, but their mocking laughter and belittling sneers left little doubt that their presence was deliberate. Sarah, voice quivering, tried to explain that she had to compare prices on different brands because money was tight, but one of the men, sporting a leather vest patched with signs of questionable affiliations, told her to hurry up and get out of their way, as though her financial worries made her unworthy of common courtesy. Mark hovered at the corner of the aisle, uncertain whether he should intervene or if security might already be on the way, yet it quickly became clear that no assistance was forthcoming. He took a hesitant step forward, scanning the area for a manager or staff member, only to see employees shrinking back with anxious glances, too intimidated by the men's aggressive posturing to interfere. Sarah tried to mutter an apology, her voice scarcely above a whisper, as she attempted to steer her cart around them, but they moved in unison to block her, as though they were enacting a well-rehearsed scene of intimidation. One of the bullies snickered at the meager contents of her cart. Just a handful of essentials, a couple of jars of baby food, and the formula, ridiculing her inability to afford anything more substantial. That cruel laughter, echoing with the unkindness of those who have never known want, struck a chord in Mark's conscience, stirring memories of his own humble beginnings back in Boston where corners were sometimes cut and groceries had to be budgeted carefully. Driven by an innate desire to protect the vulnerable, Mark tightened his grip around the cart handle and took a decisive stride forward, positioning himself directly beside Sarah in a silent, unspoken act of solidarity. When the men looked up, realization dawned on them that the person standing in defense of this clearly distraught single mother was a famous actor, and for a moment, it appeared they might retreat out of sheer surprise. Yet their leader, a broad-shouldered man with menacing tattoos creeping from his collarbones to his wrists, saw something in Mark's eyes that spurred him on instead of frightening him away, a resolve that refused to be cowed by bullies. Sarah's face registered a mixture of relief and embarrassment at having to rely on a stranger for protection, even if that stranger happened to be someone as renowned as Mark Wahlberg. "You all right there?" Mark asked quietly, directing his voice toward her but ensuring the men could hear the unwavering determination in his tone, which resonated through the aisle like a prelude to confrontation. Sarah nodded, lips quivering, unsure whether she should feel grateful or afraid that these men might lash out physically, especially now that Mark had thrown himself between them. The tension thickened like a brewing storm, with the overhead music, an innocuous, upbeat pop tune, providing an unsettling contrast to the hostility playing out just a few feet away. Mark's gaze flicked to the store entrance, assessing just how swiftly he could get Sarah, and perhaps her groceries, out of harm's way should matters escalate beyond verbal harassment. He considered calling for the store manager, but the fleeting glimpses he caught of staff ducking behind displays or eyeing the security cameras suggested no immediate help would be forthcoming. The smell of freshly misted lettuce and ripe tomatoes from the produce display felt jarringly incongruous with the growing aggression in the men's postures, a living testament to how easily everyday life can veer into chaos. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, the echo of previous encounters with rough characters and the echoes of roles he had trained for on set merging into a singular moment that felt both cinematic and terrifyingly real. Sarah clutched her shopping list and formula closer, every iota of her body language revealing just how tired she was of having to fight these battles alone, how the daily grind of single parenthood had already drained her reserves of resilience. Her eyes, brimming with tears, locked onto Mark's for a split second, silently conveying a plea for help that needed no words. One of the bullies, noticing the shift in power dynamics, spat a derogatory remark in Mark's direction, questioning why a Hollywood star would demean himself by mingling with lowlives, inadvertently exposing the cruelty simmering beneath a brittle exterior. Though Mark could feel the sting of that insult, he maintained a calm expression and responded with measured clarity, pointing out that decency shouldn't be reserved for the privileged but should extend to anyone, especially someone in dire need. His retort hung in the air, momentarily freezing the group's taunts, as even bullies had to acknowledge the moral truth of his statement. Still, the tension thrummed like an unstrummed guitar string, an energy waiting to explode into confrontation at any moment, and Sarah's trembling hands did not go unnoticed. Mark could sense that she was on the verge of abandoning her groceries altogether, as fear threatened to override her need for these essential items. But he resolved that he wouldn't allow these men to rob her of her dignity or her basic supplies. With every heartbeat, he recalled the times in his life when a helping hand, sometimes from unexpected places, was the difference between despair and hope, urging him now to do the same for Sarah. The silence stretched to an uncomfortable length, punctuated only by the hum of the store's overhead fans, as the bullies sized him up, perhaps trying to decide if a physical altercation was worth the risk of attracting more public scrutiny. Mark, reading the situation, didn't flinch or back down. Instead, he positioned his body subtly so Sarah would remain shielded from their line of fire, fully prepared to step in if words failed and fists began to fly. He exuded a calm, unwavering presence, far from the bravado of an action star looking for a fight, but radiating the quiet confidence of a man driven by conscience rather than ego. Without any instructions, Sarah managed to slide her cart a half-step closer to Mark's, as though accepting the silent alliance he offered, and for a moment, it felt as if the entire store collectively held its breath. Mark could hear the distant beep of a register scanning someone else's groceries, a mundane reminder that life goes on even in the midst of conflict, fueling his resolve that this moment would not end in tragedy or capitulation. He kept his voice low, politely requesting the men move aside and let Sarah finish her shopping in peace, laying each word down carefully like a tenuous bridge between civility and confrontation. The ringleader regarded Mark's measured demeanor with a sneer that twitched at the corner of his mouth, as if deciding whether to escalate or retreat, momentarily caught between the fear of public repercussions and an ingrained need to dominate. Sarah, tears threatening to betray her composure, whispered a shaky thank you, barely audible beneath the thunderous pulse in her ears, but Mark's brief nod of acknowledgement told her she was no longer standing alone. In that charged slice of time, the grocery store, an otherwise ordinary place of routine transactions, became a stage for human decency, a backdrop against which a single mother's struggles collided with the inflexibility of callous individuals and the unwavering compassion of a stranger committed to doing what was right. The leader of the trio stood rigidly near the stacked cans of vegetables, glaring at Mark and Sarah like a predator sizing up cornered prey. But beneath that bravado lay a lifetime of bottled-up rage and disappointment that had manifested in the cruelest of ways. He had grown up in a harsh environment, where respect was measured by how quickly you could dominate others, and that dark lesson had seeped into every aspect of his being, warping whatever kindness might once have resided in his heart. The two men flanking him, though perhaps less imposing in stature, clung to his every word in desperate search of a sense of belonging they had never truly found, nodding and jeering at Sarah's vulnerability like a twisted chorus. Both followers had been outcasts in their youth, mocked and belittled by peers, harboring a simmering anger that transformed into a cruel desire to strike before being struck, just to avoid the pain of rejection. Each had found, in the ringleader's orbit, a perverse form of brotherhood that validated their grievances against a world they felt had discarded them. Mark, absorbing the subtle clues behind their sneering expressions and tense body language, recognized all too well that these men were no strangers to violence. In fact, they had shaped their identities around it. While Sarah clung to her shopping cart, trembling under the weight of their stares, Mark discreetly shifted his posture, fully aware that a single misstep could provoke a dangerous reaction from this group that thrived on dominance. The leader's gaze, sharp as a blade, flicked between Mark and Sarah, as though gauging which target would crumble first under his intimidation, a tactic he had perfected through years of coercing people into compliance. He thought he sensed fear emanating from Mark, perhaps an illusion conjured by the bully's collective arrogance, and believed he could double down on his aggression to force a retreat without any substantial challenge. Mark, however, stood resolute, recalling his own turbulent upbringing on the gritty streets of Boston, where he had once walked a precarious line between becoming a victim or becoming someone who could protect others from victimhood. The tension crackled in the air, as if a live wire had been stripped bare in the middle of the grocery store, turning a once ordinary setting into a powder keg of hostile energies. One of the henchmen, a wiry figure with darting eyes that spoke of too many nights spent sleeping in cars and on dingy couches, let out a derisive laugh, almost as if he found sick enjoyment in seeing Sarah's distress. He had never learned a healthier way to deal with the pain of being overlooked and neglected, so cruelty became his twisted form of validation, a way to push others down so he could momentarily feel above them. The other accomplice, whose bulky arms bore scars of brawls that had long since faded into half-remembered nights, seemed almost bored by the confrontation, as though he had already played out the scenario in his head and concluded that Sarah's tears would not stir any empathy in his hardened soul. Mark could see how each man's bitterness tangled with the next, forming a kind of corrosive unity that found relief only in subjugating those weaker than themselves. Sarah, eyes brimming with tears, felt her pulse thunder in her throat, unable to reconcile how a simple trip to pick up necessities for her child had morphed into a harrowing standoff with men who treated kindness as a foreign concept. Memories of previous run-ins with aggressive strangers flashed in her mind, but this situation felt more intense, given how these bullies seemed to take pleasure in every sign of fear she displayed. She gripped the cart tighter, her knuckles turning white, as though the metal frame were the only anchor keeping her upright while the ground threatened to give way beneath her. Mark's calm gaze flicked toward her, silently reassuring her that she was no longer alone, that he recognized the profound injustice in these men's actions and would stand his ground. The ringleader noticed that wordless exchange and smirked, his lips curling upward like a predator about to lunge, revealing that he resented anyone who dared to disrupt his reign of intimidation. He angled his body toward Mark, narrowing the distance by a few inches, and spoke in a cold, controlled voice that held a promise of violence if Mark continued to interfere. In the tense hush of the aisle, Mark's voice held an even-keeled firmness when he replied that no one deserved to be bullied for simply trying to provide for their child, and that decency was not some rare commodity. The lead bully snorted at that notion, muttering something about how the world was a grim place where only the strong survived, and Mark wondered if there was ever a time when that same man had believed otherwise. The two underlings exchanged glances, their shared smirks revealing an unspoken pact that it was them against everyone else. A twisted sense of camaraderie forged in mutual resentment of a society they felt had turned its back on them. Mark's thoughts swirled with questions. What series of misfortunes had hardened these men so thoroughly that they would derive satisfaction from seeing a struggling mother quake with fear? Did they imagine themselves as victims of some grand injustice, lashing out at anyone who reminded them of their own vulnerability? He recalled times when he had nearly been steered down a similarly dark path, and a strange empathy flickered within him, though it was overshadowed by the imperative to protect Sarah and her baby's well-being. The overhead lights seemed to grow dimmer, or perhaps the tension simply made the store feel smaller, its once spacious aisles closing in around them like the walls of a fortress. A store employee peeked around a display of gourmet cheeses, only to shrink back when the lead bully shot him a venomous glare that all but screamed for him to stay out of it. Mark watched that employee retreat and felt a pang of disappointment, yet he could scarcely blame the man for prioritizing his own safety when faced with a trio so clearly unafraid of repercussions. The lead bully turned his attention back to Sarah, uttering a contemptuous remark about how pathetic it was that she needed someone else to fight her battles, ignoring the fact that her daily struggle to raise a child on limited means was a battle she fought every waking hour. Sarah sucked in a wavering breath, tears spilling down her cheeks, yet she fought to keep her voice steady as she insisted that no one had the right to bully another human being. no matter their own hardships. The wiry henchman sneered at that moral stand, retorting that hardships only made someone tough if they learned to punch back, effectively spitting on the notion of compassion or mutual respect. Mark could feel the slow burn of anger welling up inside him, a desire to demand that these men stand down immediately, but he tempered it with the knowledge that aggression often begot more aggression. Instead, he made sure his voice held no trace of fear when he repeated that they should leave Sarah alone, or else risk facing consequences they might not anticipate. The ringleader's scarred knuckles curled into fists momentarily, his body tensing as if he were preparing for a brawl, but the presence of Mark's celebrity, a certain spotlight they couldn't fully ignore, kept him from outright throwing the first punch. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, for in some corner of his mind he understood that harming a high-profile figure in public could lead to attention far beyond the scope of what he was prepared to handle. The other two bullies shifted, glancing at each other with brief unease, hinting that they were not entirely united in how to proceed now that the stakes had been raised. Yet even that fleeting hesitation bristled with the possibility of a violent outburst, as no one wanted to lose face in front of the others. Mark sensed the confrontation teetering on the edge of something far more dangerous than harsh words, and he tried once more to appeal to the sliver of humanity that must exist, however buried, within these men. Sarah, though shaken, realized that Mark was attempting to defuse the situation rather than escalate it, and she quietly added that she simply wanted to finish her shopping and go home to her child. The brief mention of her child seemed to stir conflicting emotions in the group, and Mark saw the leader's gaze falter for a fraction of a second, as though a distant memory or regret flashed through his mind. Something about that vulnerability caught Mark's attention, and he recognized that, for all their outward displays of bravado, these men were wrestling with complex inner turmoil born of harsh life experiences. Any empathy that tugged at them was swiftly smothered by pride, however, and the ringleader reclaimed his sneer, turning back to his cohorts with an air of finality, as though forging a collective decision on how to proceed. Mark steeled himself, every muscle tensing, braced for the worst while praying for a moment of clarity that would snap them out of their antagonistic spiral. The ringleader opened his mouth to speak, but whatever words he was about to hurl at Sarah and Mark were drowned out by the distant, frantic call of a manager paging store security, as an overhead announcement finally crackled to life. Though it was uncertain whether security would arrive in time, the sudden reality check caused the two henchmen to shuffle nervously, and the ringleader let out a low curse, giving Mark one final glare brimming with contempt and unresolved rage. He muttered that they weren't done yet, a promise that whatever animosity had been sparked here would soon take a more dangerous turn, and Mark nodded grimly, fully aware that the bullies had no intention of backing down quietly. Sarah stood frozen, tears still clinging to her cheeks, unable to determine whether she should feel relieved or terrified by that cryptic statement, fearing the confrontation was far from over. Mark, jaw set in determination, resolved to see this through to the end, no matter the cost, because leaving Sarah unprotected against these men's retribution was simply not an option. The ringleader and his cronies stomped off with a swagger meant to reclaim some semblance of power, but they threw dark looks over their shoulders, ensuring Mark and Sarah knew this altercation was merely the prologue to something larger. In that charged moment, the rest of the store seemed to erupt back into motion. A cashier called for a price check, a child whined for candy, and the manager's overhead voice continued paging security, even as Mark locked eyes with Sarah, silently assuring her that neither of them would have to face the next confrontation alone. Mark stood in the grocery aisle long after the bullies stomped away, his heart thudding against his ribs, and in that trembling aftermath, unbidden memories of his own rough-and-tumble youth came flooding back with a startling vividness that nearly overwhelmed him. He could almost feel the cracked pavement of Boston's Dorchester neighborhood beneath his sneakers again, hear the distant sirens and shouted threats that had once blended into the white noise of daily life. In those days, he was just another kid on the corner, desperate to prove himself in a world that seemed to reward only the tough and the unforgiving. And he learned too young that a single misstep could set off a chain of dangerous consequences. He recalled older boys hovering menacingly near the basketball courts, ready to take advantage of anyone who let their guard down, and the sick knot of dread in his stomach whenever someone bigger and meaner decided to single him out. Sometimes, he fought back with a surge of bravado, telling himself he was defending his honor. But deep down, he always knew there was something tragic about being forced to harden one's heart just to survive. Every bruise, every fight, every instance of being cornered and mocked or shoved against a wall left a mark on him, shaping his temperament in ways he never fully acknowledged until years later. When fame eventually came knocking and gave him the means to leave those streets behind, he thought he'd shed that old skin forever. But nights like this reminded him that the scars of the past were never truly gone. He'd been fortunate enough to find redemption through acting, discipline, and sheer will, yet he knew countless others never escaped that cycle of fear and aggression, trapped in the role of bully or bullied with no clear path to freedom. Seeing Sarah's trembling shoulders and tear-streaked cheeks had reopened a door in his mind, revealing the boy he once was powerless in front of those who thrived on intimidation and cruelty. He remembered being called names that stung worse than physical blows, words that insinuated he would never be good enough or strong enough to stand on his own 2 feet, and how that slowly ate away at his self-worth. Though he had since carved out a successful career, traveled the world, and shared jokes with renowned directors, a part of him still felt that same desperation to prove that he was more than the sum of his wounds. He glanced down at his hands, half expecting to see the same scraped knuckles from his youth, a stark reminder of how often he resorted to violence before he learned the power of channeling anger into something constructive. That memory brought him to the present, illuminating precisely why he refused to walk away and leave Sarah to fend for herself against hardened individuals who saw kindness as a weakness to exploit. She reminded him of the single mothers he had witnessed in his neighborhood back in the day, worn thin by life's relentless barrage of bills, broken promises, and late shifts, forever trapped in the cycle of having too much responsibility and too little support. Countless times, Mark would see them lining up at corner stores, clinging to their meager earnings, counting out the exact change for the groceries they needed, all while doing their best to hide the weariness in their eyes. It struck him that Sarah's plight was shared by so many, especially in the very places society tended to overlook, and that bullies often targeted those whose burdens were already heavy enough to break their spirit. His skin prickled with the memory of being hit and harassed, made to feel like less than nothing, and he recognized that same torment in Sarah's defeated posture when confronted by cruelty. He vowed silently that he would not let those men, or anyone else, perpetuate that toxic cycle, especially not on his watch, not when he was in a position to intervene. He thought of how, as a teenager, he'd sometimes fantasized about a savior swooping in to pull him out of a seemingly hopeless situation, someone who would stand up for him even when others stayed silent. The realization that he could now be that person for someone else filled him with a sense of purpose that transcended the immediate danger. Yet he also felt a pang of sadness, knowing that the 3 men who had just walked away were likely the product of a similar environment, where hope was scarce and cruelty became a twisted coping mechanism. If circumstances had been different, if Mark had missed out on certain key opportunities, he could have easily ended up with men like them, steeped in bitterness and believing that power was the only way to earn respect. That thought sobered him, reminding him how thin the line could be between protector and oppressor, shaped by life's merciless currents and the decisions one made along the way. He didn't know if the leader or his henchmen had kids of their own, but imagining such a possibility pained him, fueling an ardent wish that their children, if they existed, would escape the same harrowing path. Standing amid the swirling emotions of relief, anger, and lingering fear, Mark exhaled shakily, sensing that Sarah, too, felt the storm of repressed trauma rolling off him. When she looked at him, eyes searching for reassurance, he managed a tight but genuine smile, silently communicating that whatever happened next, he would see it through to the end. He felt the old adrenaline from his youth pumping through his veins, that primal fight-or-flight response. Yet the difference now was he had learned how to maintain calm and wield that adrenaline strategically rather than let it control him. The store's hum returned to his consciousness. The buzz of fluorescent lighting, the chatter of distant shoppers, the rattle of carts against the polished floor, though it all felt strangely muted after the peak of confrontation. A distant memory emerged of an older friend who once stepped between a scrawny, fearful Mark and a looming group of neighborhood bullies, risking his own safety to stand up for someone who couldn't defend himself. That brief act of courage left a lasting impression on Mark, shaping his moral code and instilling in him the conviction that true strength was found in compassion, not domination. Tonight, he found himself mirroring that experience, standing tall for someone in dire need, despite the very real threat of violence or public scandal that might ensue. His mind churned, weighed down by conflicting impulses. The wish to guide those bullies toward better choices, the protectiveness he felt toward Sarah, and the quiet uncertainty about whether the situation would escalate outside the store. He recalled that in his teenage years, walking away from a fight or avoiding escalation was often viewed as cowardice. But age and perspective had taught him that walking away could sometimes be the bravest choice of all. The difference, however, was that leaving now, with the bullies still lurking somewhere nearby, might put Sarah in greater peril, so leaving simply wasn't an option. He took a deep breath, turning to Sarah with a gentle question. Was she all right? Did she need a moment to compose herself? Her trembling nod told him that she was far from okay. Yet she was grateful beyond words that someone had stood by her in this ordeal. The sight of her shaken yet determined expression tapped into Mark's own sense of responsibility, fueling him with renewed resolve to see this through. He could remember a dozen instances when he, too, felt shaken yet determined, forging ahead with a mixture of fear and defiance in a world that didn't seem to care about his struggles. That memory, though painful, reminded him how crucial even a single act of support or kindness could be, how it might catch a person right at the brink of despair and pull them back onto solid ground. As shoppers edged cautiously around them, whispering in hushed tones about the altercation, Mark noticed that no one asked if Sarah was okay, just as no one ever seemed to ask him if he was okay all those years ago. The pattern felt hauntingly familiar, a reflection of how the world often expects people to endure quietly while chaos and cruelty unfold mere steps away. He didn't blame the bystanders, for he knew all too well how fear of retaliation can paralyze one's better instincts. But it strengthened his resolve that he wouldn't abandon her now, no matter what. The store's overhead speakers played a slow, melodic tune that felt jarringly out of place compared to the tumult in his chest, and he caught himself imagining how different this scene would be if folks simply chose to band together against injustice. Though his memory was filled with tales of street fights and near misses, it was also sprinkled with recollections of good people who chose to do the right thing, reminding him that darkness wasn't the entire story. That duality swirled within him as he felt Sarah lightly grip the sleeve of his jacket, a silent plea not to leave her alone in this uncertain aftermath. He felt the weight of her trust settle on his shoulders, blending with the old burdens he'd carried for so long, and realized that in protecting her, he was also protecting the person he once was, the frightened kid who needed someone to speak up. The echo of the bullies' departing footsteps reverberated in his mind, a warning that their conflict was far from resolved. But Mark believed that facing them again, if it came to that, would be easier than living with the guilt of walking away. An uneasy calm shrouded the aisle, broken only by Sarah's soft sniffles and the occasional squeak of another customer's cart rolling by. Mark inhaled slowly, letting his chest expand with renewed determination, as he shifted his focus away from the heartbreak of memory toward the practical steps he needed to ensure Sarah's safety. Despite the tension twisting in his stomach, he tried to console her, uttering a quiet promise that whatever happened next, they would face it together, so she wouldn't have to stand alone in a world that too often turned a blind eye to suffering. Even as he spoke those words, his mind conjured another potent flash of his younger self, wishing for a protector who never came, his bruised fists clenched in frustrated isolation. That recollection of being let down fueled his determination, reinforcing the conviction that he would not let Sarah's pleas go unanswered the way his had been so many years ago. He mustered a small, reassuring grin, urging her to gather whatever groceries she still needed and assuring her that he would stay close by, ready to intervene if the bullies dared to return. The knowledge that he had already changed the narrative, her narrative, as well as his own, offered a small, glowing ember of hope in the gloom of his resurfacing memories. He recognized, with a bittersweet twinge, that while he couldn't change the pain of his past, he could at least ensure that the present moment ended on a higher note than the trauma that once enveloped him. That realization gave him the strength he needed, a subtle reinforcement of willpower that steadied his resolve and quieted the tremors of his recalled nightmares. He glanced around at the remaining shoppers, some darting curious glances, others feigning ignorance, and though he understood their reluctance to become involved, he silently wished that fewer people would stand by when they witnessed cruelty. Sarah gazed at him as though he were some kind of guardian angel, an exaggeration, he thought, since he was merely an actor who had been in the right place at the right time and chosen to do the right thing. But if that simple choice could ease her suffering, if it could help reconcile his own regrets from long ago, then he was determined to follow it through to the end, no matter how rocky the road became. The checkout lanes, lined with impulse-buy candy bars and glossy tabloid magazines, seemed worlds apart from the tension lingering in the produce aisle. Yet as Mark and Sarah slowly made their way toward the front of the store, the dread in Sarah's trembling posture announced that trouble was far from over. She clutched her small basket, its modest contents revealing a life lived on a tight budget. Baby formula, diapers, a few cans of soup, while Mark walked beside her, shoulders taut, eyes continuously scanning for any sign of the bullies. The rhythmic beep of the registers offered a semblance of normalcy, and unsuspecting customers chattered about trivial matters, sales, coupons, the weather, as if unaware that just minutes ago, a charged confrontation had nearly broken out in the aisles. Sarah's cheeks burned with lingering humiliation, still feeling the weight of every judgmental stare she believed had fallen on her when she'd been cornered, and every step toward the checkout felt like a step deeper into the unknown. Mark noticed how her hands shook, and he quietly placed a reassuring palm against her arm, hoping to lend her a measure of confidence that she could see this errand through without further incident. The overhead lights seemed harsher now, glaring off the polished floors and reflecting off the metal of the shopping carts, as though magnifying every tension-filled moment they had experienced. As they neared the row of checkouts, a faint prickle skittered up Mark's spine, warning him that the bullies would not be content to slink away without imposing themselves one last time. He spied the broad-shouldered ringleader loitering near a display of half-priced candy, feigning casual interest in a tabloid cover but flicking his gaze toward Mark and Sarah with barely contained hostility. The other two cronies were hovering close by, arms folded, casting sidelong glances at passing customers, daring anyone to ask them to move or mind their manners. Sarah drew in a shaky breath, her voice small when she whispered her gratitude to Mark for not abandoning her, even though his presence had likely escalated the situation. Mark only gave a slight nod, too focused on the men's posturing to formulate a calming reply, knowing all it would take was a single spark to reignite the conflict. A lone security guard stood near the store entrance, his attention split between greeting customers and warily watching the bullies, though he looked more like he was trying to work up the courage to intervene than actually preparing to do so. Mark suppressed a frustrated sigh. He understood that employees weren't trained for full-scale altercations and that corporate liability concerns often deterred direct involvement, but the lack of immediate backup meant he would have to rely on his own wits and presence. Sarah stepped into the queue at the shortest checkout line she could find, her eyes darting nervously to the side, where the men seemed to be angling themselves for a closer vantage point. The overhead announcement system crackled, calling for additional cashiers to open a lane, but the disjointed recording did little to alleviate the growing knot of tension that was coiling in Sarah's stomach. A mother with two young children glanced curiously at Mark, then quickly moved her kids to another line, as though sensing the undercurrent of danger that lurked by proximity. The cashier in Sarah's line, a teenager with earbuds peeking out from beneath her store-issued cap, barely looked up as she scanned items for the customer ahead, blissfully unaware of the potential chaos forming just behind her. Mark tried to exude an air of calm confidence, standing at Sarah's side like a guardian, though inwardly he felt the adrenaline surging again, reminding him that any false move could put them both at risk. The line inched forward, and Sarah placed her few items on the conveyor belt, each beep echoing like a question mark. Would they be allowed to leave peacefully, or would this checkout line become a flashpoint for something more dangerous than hostile words? The ringleader, perhaps spotting the fear etched into Sarah's face, decided it was time to reassert his presence, and he strode forward with heavy steps, standing just close enough that his looming figure cast an unwelcome shadow over her transaction. Mark caught the movement, angling his body slightly to block the man's approach, ready to step between them if he so much as raised a hand in threat. The cashier, catching a glimpse of the tension, faltered mid-scan, eyes widening, but she quickly resumed her robotic motions, likely hoping to finish her shift without witnessing any actual violence. Sarah's breath caught in her throat when she felt the man's gaze burning into her, a silent message that he wanted her to remember who held the power here, who decided whether she could live the rest of this night in peace or in fear. Mark, refusing to be intimidated, squared his shoulders and gave the ringleader a clear, unwavering look, silently conveying that this time, the bully had chosen the wrong person to harass. The man's lips peeled back in a mocking smile, and he leaned in as if to whisper something menacing to Sarah, but Mark took one deliberate step forward, effectively interposing himself. Shoppers in nearby lines sensed the impending confrontation, a hush falling over them as they surreptitiously observed, torn between the impulse to flee and a grim curiosity to see how it would unfold. The ringleader's cronies stood just behind him, forming a small wall of intimidation, arms crossed and jaws set, as if they were used to flexing muscle in public spaces to get their way. Sarah's cheeks grew paler by the second, and she forced herself to rummage in her purse for a handful of crumpled bills, determined to complete this purchase and be rid of the nightmarish confrontation that had hijacked her simple errand. The cashier dropped a bag of diapers into a plastic sack, her hands shaking enough that the bag crinkled awkwardly, and the tension seemed to climb another notch, feeding off the fear that saturated the air. Mark allowed a quiet, steady breath to fill his lungs, recalling how, in countless movie roles, he had portrayed characters who faced down adversaries, but this was real life, and the stakes were immeasurably higher. He tried appealing to the small sliver of humanity he had glimpsed earlier in the ringleader's eyes, urging him in a low voice to step back and let Sarah finalize her purchase, reminding him that pushing this further would only lead to dire consequences. The man scoffed, retorting that no famous actor was going to tell him what he could or couldn't do, and he puffed out his chest in a display of bravado, as though determined to prove himself the toughest in the room. The manager, flanked by the jittery security guard, approached from the entrance, face taut with concern, but he hesitated at the edge of the lanes, clearly unsure how to de-escalate a conflict that involved a high-profile celebrity and 3 intimidating agitators. By now, more onlookers had gathered, some discreetly filming with their phones, possibly hoping to catch a viral moment, while others looked genuinely worried for Sarah's safety. Mark felt a wave of frustration, knowing that videos might twist the narrative or spark sensationalist headlines, but he also understood the power of public scrutiny might deter the bullies from turning this into a full-scale brawl. The ringleader, however, seemed emboldened by the attention, as if playing to an invisible audience that thrived on chaos, and he inched even closer, testing Mark's willingness to physically push him away. Sarah stumbled over an apology, though she had nothing to be sorry for, her voice trembling as she handed the cashier her wrinkled banknotes, hoping to at least leave the store with the supplies she so desperately needed. Mark felt his heart pounding like a drumbeat, the old fight-or-flight reflex awakening in him with renewed vigor, but he kept his expression focused, resolute, even as images of a brutal confrontation flashed through his mind. The lead bully's eyes danced with a mix of malice and uncertainty, hinting that while he thrived on intimidation, he was not entirely sure how far he was willing to take this in front of so many witnesses. One of his underlings muttered something about how Sarah was still too pathetic to defend herself, and Mark's stomach twisted at the cruelty embedded in that remark, an insult aimed at both Sarah's vulnerable state and Mark's protective stance. Sarah, cheeks stained with tears, pressed trembling fingers against her lips, trying not to sob in front of everyone, knowing that showing more emotion might only fuel the bully's twisted sense of power. The manager finally stepped forward, clearing his throat in what seemed an attempt at authority, but the quiver in his voice undermined his command as he asked the men to leave, emphasizing that the store had security footage that could be handed over to the police. The words barely penetrated the standoff, but the mention of legal repercussions seemed to make the 2 cronies twitch uneasily, their gazes flicking from the manager to the looming figure of Mark. Sensing the atmosphere shift, Mark seized the moment, quietly stating that it was time to let Sarah pay and depart without any more harassment, adding that if the ringleader had any sense, he would take his friends and walk away before the night ended in handcuffs. The ringleader clenched his jaw, torn between saving face and recognizing that continuing to push the envelope could spiral out of control in a very public, very irreversible way. Silence stretched taut as the cashier counted Sarah's money and handed over her change, her hand trembling so badly that a coin slipped from her grasp and rolled along the floor. It felt like the world slowed in that instant, the clink of metal on tile magnified to the volume of a thunderclap, and Sarah dropped to her knees to retrieve it, eyes burning with a cocktail of shame and fury. Mark stood between her and the bullies, unyielding, his body language screaming that he would not stand down, no matter how they might try to corner them again. For a moment, the ringleader looked like he might lunge forward, fists flexing with pent-up rage, but the presence of the manager, the security guard, and a half-dozen onlookers likely filming with smartphones pinned him in a spotlight he wasn't prepared for. Exhaling a harsh breath, he finally stepped back, directing a venomous glare at Mark and muttering an ugly promise that they hadn't seen the last of him, as though this petty theater were some kind of twisted stage for future retribution. The two cronies followed suit, reluctant scowls marking their retreat, leaving a charged hush in their wake, broken only by the store's robotic announcements about daily specials. Sarah, tears now flowing freely down her face, stood up with her groceries clutched in shaky arms, and Mark positioned a supportive hand at the small of her back, guiding her away from the scene. The manager and security guard exchanged relieved glances, grateful that the crisis hadn't erupted into physical violence, though the tension in the store remained palpable, an invisible residue from the near altercation. Mark cast a final glance at the bullies' retreating forms, a swirl of conflicting emotions surging in his mind, from anger to pity to a cautious vigilance that told him this wasn't truly over. The overhead lights seemed to flicker for a moment, or maybe his eyes played tricks on him, still riding the adrenaline that made every sense hyper-aware of potential threats. Sarah gazed up at him, her lips curved in a tremulous attempt at a smile, gratitude and exhaustion etched into every line of her face, as they stepped away from the checkout and into the next uncertain chapter of the night. The click of the store's automatic doors and the sudden rush of cool night air marked a temporary reprieve for Mark and Sarah as they stepped into the parking lot, but the lingering sense of unease weighed heavily on them both, creating a tension that no amount of fresh oxygen could immediately dispel. Even with her groceries in hand, Sarah's shoulders slumped under the invisible burden of anxiety, and Mark could feel her trembling beside him, painfully aware that the bullies might still be lurking just out of sight. The neon glow of the grocery store's sign cast a puddle of bluish light on the asphalt, reflecting on puddles left by a recent drizzle, and the sound of distant traffic underscored the uneasy silence that hung between them. Before they could decide on their next move, two elderly shoppers who had witnessed part of the confrontation hurried over, offering soft-spoken words of support that, while timid, still signaled a willingness to stand with Mark and Sarah against injustice. One of them, a retired schoolteacher with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, placed a gentle hand on Sarah's arm and assured her that not everyone would turn a blind eye, especially when someone's safety was in jeopardy. The other, clutching a knit purse, whispered that she had already informed the store's security guard that this situation needed a careful eye, suggesting the bullies might be waiting in the parking lot to launch another attack. Sarah tried to summon a grateful smile through quivering lips, the presence of these two unexpected allies fanning a spark of renewed courage in her weary eyes. Mark, nodding in appreciation, felt a warmth bloom in his chest as he realized that not all bystanders were content to let cruelty go unchallenged, and he quietly thanked them for stepping forward. The pair offered to walk alongside Sarah to her car, though the teacher confessed with a trembling laugh that she wouldn't be much of a bodyguard if it came down to a brawl, but she was at least willing to call the police if anything went awry. Mark reassured them that he had no intention of letting the situation escalate into violence if it could be avoided, though he carried himself with a calm readiness, every nerve primed to protect Sarah should the bullies reemerge. A moment later, a store clerk, apparently on a break, hurried up from behind, panting slightly as he caught his breath, then stammered an apology for not stepping in sooner, claiming he had only just learned what was happening. He offered a small folding chair from the employee area so Sarah could sit down, noticing how pale and drained she looked, and insisted he would keep watch while Mark helped load her groceries. This small cluster of people, diverse in age and background, banded together in the quiet haze of the fluorescent parking lot lights, presenting a united front far more powerful than the intimidation the bullies had tried to impose. Sarah sank onto the chair with a heavy sigh of relief, murmuring words of thanks as she clutched her bag of diapers and formula, as though afraid it would vanish if she let it go for even a second. A soft murmur of conversation passed between the older shoppers and the employee, each exchanging worried glances and reassuring words about how no one should have to face that kind of harassment, whether they were a single mom or a world-famous actor. Mark listened, his chest tight with gratitude, reflecting on how, in his younger days, the community's silence often emboldened bullies. But here, in a random grocery store parking lot, people had chosen to be brave together. The security guard, a middle-aged man with a perpetual frown and a flashlight dangling from his belt, finally mustered the courage to step forward, giving Mark a tense nod and informing him that the store's cameras had caught footage of the incident should the police need evidence. Though his tone was clipped and formal, betraying a nervous undercurrent, his presence added another layer of support, a reassurance that, at least on store property, the law would be on their side if something more serious transpired. Sensing the tide beginning to turn, Mark felt emboldened to ask if anyone had seen the bullies leave, hoping to glean whether they had already fled or might be lying in wait. The teacher shook her head, explaining that she only saw them storm out, muttering curses, but hadn't followed them far enough to see if they got into a vehicle or disappeared on foot. The store clerk frowned, recalling a vague glimpse of 3 men skulking around the far corner of the lot, but he couldn't confirm if they were the same troublemakers or just random passers-by. Sarah's heartbeat quickened at that revelation, but the teacher squeezed her shoulder gently, assuring her that they would walk together and remain vigilant, reminding her that fear often gains its real power when people face it alone. Gathering her last reserve of courage, Sarah rose from the folding chair, her legs still wobbly, and thanked every new ally individually, her eyes brimming with a mixture of gratitude and lingering terror. Mark placed a steadying hand on her back, guiding her toward her aging sedan while the small entourage flanked them, forming an impromptu protective circle. Each step across the asphalt felt like crossing a battlefield, the night air alive with the possibility that the bullies could emerge from the darkness at any moment. But the supportive glances shared by these new allies helped keep Sarah's dread from overwhelming her. Partway to the car, a college student who had been quietly filming from a distance approached, phone still clutched in shaky hands, confessing that he'd caught the confrontation inside on video and wanted to help in any way he could. Mark, initially wary about how viral videos might spin the story, ultimately thanked the student for caring enough to document proof of the men's bullying, especially if it discouraged them from retaliating. The student nodded vigorously, offering to share the footage with Sarah or the authorities, explaining that he despised how some people thrived on picking on the vulnerable, and Mark felt a glimmer of hope at the sincerity in his voice. The teacher, the clerk, the 2 elderly shoppers, and the newly arrived student formed a loose ring around Sarah's car as she unlocked the trunk, their eyes scanning the perimeter for any sign of danger. Mark quietly handed her bags over, ensuring each precious item made it safely into the trunk, hyper-aware of every scrape on the asphalt and every flicker of motion in the periphery of his vision. Though the bullies were nowhere in sight, the tension weighed on each breath, rendering the simple act of loading groceries an exercise in both caution and solidarity. Sarah's hands still shook as she tried to fit the formula and diapers into a snug corner, tears brimming again at the kindness of strangers who had chosen to stand beside her in her most vulnerable moment. She whispered that she had never expected anyone, let alone a celebrity, to go out of their way for her, and that she felt both humbled and somewhat guilty for drawing so many people into her troubles. Mark reassured her that compassion wasn't something to feel guilty about, that in a just world, people shouldn't have to face cruelty in isolation, and that he was simply glad he could be there when she needed help. The security guard hovered at the edge of the group, radio crackling intermittently with mundane updates about store closing procedures. Yet he kept a watchful gaze on the lot, finally earning the older shopper's gratitude for stepping up when it really mattered. A hush settled momentarily over the small congregation, as though everyone present was collectively taking a breath after the relentless surge of adrenaline that had marked the past hour. The distant glow of the streetlights highlighted the thoughtful expressions on the faces gathered there, each person confronting the sobering truth that this kind of harassment could happen to anyone, at any time, if no one dared to stand in opposition. Sarah closed her trunk, hugging her purse tightly to her chest, whispering another heartfelt "thank you" to the group, her voice catching on the tears she was trying to hold back. The store clerk offered to walk her through a side exit leading to a better lit street, while the teacher insisted she follow up with any needed legal steps, emphasizing that Sarah deserved closure, not perpetual fear. Mark, acknowledging the earnestness in each person's concern, felt his heart swell with a mixture of pride and relief. No cinematic script could capture the raw authenticity of strangers uniting for a shared cause. One of the elderly shoppers asked if Sarah had someone at home to support her, and when she admitted it was mostly just her and her infant, the woman pressed a slip of paper with her phone number into Sarah's hand, urging her to call if she ever felt unsafe. This simple act of solidarity seemed to move Sarah deeply, reminding her that community could exist in the unlikeliest of places, even in a grocery store parking lot on a dreary evening. The college student, still gripping his phone, blurted out that he worked part-time at a local daycare and offered to help Sarah find affordable childcare if she was interested, a gesture that left her momentarily speechless. In that spontaneous camaraderie, Mark saw the best side of humanity shining through the cracks of an otherwise frightening situation, and he realized how easily cruelty could be overpowered when good people refused to stand by in silence. As they began walking toward the side exit, the group's pace slowed, nerves wound tight from the possibility that the bullies might still be waiting to ambush them. But each new friend exchanged small talk and jokes to stave off the tension. The teacher recounted a time she stopped a schoolyard fight by simply standing between the children and refusing to move, a story that prompted the store clerk to recall how his grandfather once rescued a neighbor from a mugging by calling everyone in the neighborhood to swarm the attacker. Their anecdotes wove into an impromptu tapestry of collective bravery, instilling a subtle sense of victory over the fear that had threatened to paralyze them all. By the time they reached the better-lit street, Sarah felt her heart rate begin to settle, though she still cast anxious glances behind her, half expecting to see the ringleader and his cronies in a dark corner. Mark, reflecting on his own past, recognized that fear is often most potent when it's left unchallenged, but once confronted openly, it tends to lose its sharpest edges. He sensed Sarah's resolve quietly strengthening, fueled not only by his support but by the budding fellowship of those who had stepped forward. The security guard radioed in a final note that all seemed clear in the lot, prompting the manager to officially thank the small group for their cooperation and, in an awkward but sincere gesture, apologize on behalf of the store for their harrowing experience. The teacher placed a gentle hand on Sarah's cheek, telling her she was braver than she realized for standing her ground, and Sarah looked at Mark with a mix of exhaustion and gratitude, as though silently confirming that his intervention had transformed her entire night, and possibly her outlook on human nature. The hush of the night sky, broken only by passing cars and the hum of distant streetlights, formed a surprisingly serene backdrop for this circle of strangers, each one now bound by a fleeting but powerful sense of unity. Mark took in the moment, appreciating that while he had stepped in to shield Sarah, the true force that had countered the bullies' aggression was the collective decision of ordinary people choosing to do the right thing. The store clerk gave a little wave and headed back inside. The older shoppers parted ways with promises to keep an eye out should anything suspicious occur, and the college student lingered a moment to hand Sarah a piece of paper with his contact information for the daycare. Seeing them disperse, Mark was struck by a profound reflection. Even in a world rife with fear and cruelty, one small spark of empathy could ignite an entire lantern of hope, if only people allowed it. Sarah sniffled, wiping away tears with the back of her sleeve, and looked at Mark with a watery but genuine smile, hesitantly asking if he might walk her to her car now that the group had begun to go their separate ways. He agreed without hesitation, feeling an unspoken bond with her that transcended their brief acquaintance, a bond formed in the crucible of adversity and lit by the generosity of those who dared to stand alongside them. With a final nod to the others who had gathered, Mark guided Sarah back along the sidewalk, aware that the darkness felt a little less menacing thanks to the solidarity shown by those unexpected allies. Under the glow of a flickering street lamp, they paused at Sarah's sedan, and she placed her palm against its door, exhaling shakily as though releasing the last vestiges of panic that had gripped her since the confrontation began. Mark gently reminded her that she was no longer alone, that if the bullies tried anything further, she had every right to call the authorities, and that she now had numbers to call if she felt unsafe. She squeezed his hand in trembling gratitude, a silent thank you not only for his help but for the remarkable display of human kindness that had coalesced around them. He gave her a reassuring nod, the reflection of the street lamp dancing in his eyes, a testament to how even in the shadow of hostility, warmth could be found in the shared courage of strangers. Mark walked with Sarah toward her car one final time, making sure the parking lot was free of any lurking threats, and as they neared her vehicle, the reality that this bizarre and harrowing evening was coming to a close settled around them like a tentative embrace, equal parts relief and lingering apprehension. Her nerves still raw from the confrontation inside the store, she peered into every shadow cast by the streetlights, half expecting the bullies to leap out from behind a parked car, but each silent moment that passed without incident soothed her taut nerves by a fraction. When they finally reached her sedan, Mark gently took her keys and unlocked the driver's door, helping her into the seat with a supportive hand on her arm, determined to ensure she left this place without the slightest trace of new trauma. She looked up at him, eyes still glistening with the residue of terror and gratitude, and mustered her best attempt at a smile as she struggled to find the right words to thank him for standing in defense of a stranger when so many others chose silence. He waved off her thanks with humble sincerity, insisting that he had done only what any decent person should do, though the sparkle in his eyes betrayed the depth of pride and relief he felt at having intervened. Still, he could not entirely banish the pang of worry that gnawed at him, knowing the bullies might harbor resentment and possibly harbor vengeful thoughts, spurred by the abrupt spotlight he had cast upon them. Sarah acknowledged that fear, admitting that despite her relief, a part of her was petrified about running into those men again, worried they would hold a grudge or attempt to intimidate her once more. Mark paused, then offered to escort her home, explaining that he would gladly follow her car in his own, or even ride with her if that made her feel safer, wanting to guarantee she arrived at her doorstep unscathed. She initially hesitated, knowing what a burden that might be, but in her trembling voice, she quietly accepted, relieved that someone like Mark was willing to go so far to protect her. Their short walk through the parking lot became a symbolic journey, a bridge between fear and reassurance, as passersby who had witnessed the earlier confrontation cast knowing looks but said nothing, perhaps too drained to engage any further. Mark kept his senses on high alert, scanning the surroundings for a glint of movement or a flash of anger re-emerging. But the bullies seemed to have vanished into the night, at least for now. Each step forward brought Sarah closer to safety, and each breath she took grew marginally steadier, bolstered by the realization that compassion had managed to outshine cruelty in her darkest hour. She admitted to Mark that before all this, she had begun to lose faith in humanity, having been let down so many times while raising her child alone, juggling bills, and facing the often invisible judgments of those who did not understand her struggle. His expression softened, recalling his own past doubts and the many hours he once spent wrestling with cynicism, certain that the world was too harsh for genuine altruism. Yet tonight had reminded them both that kindness could indeed shine brightest in the midst of adversity. Mark took a final moment to peek in her back seat, ensuring there was nothing amiss inside, and gently shut the door once Sarah was settled behind the wheel, her child's empty car seat a poignant reminder of why she fought so fiercely for every can of formula. He jogged briskly to his own vehicle, parked just a few rows away, never letting her car drift completely out of sight, and slid behind his steering wheel, exhaling a tense breath as he turned the key in the ignition. A floodlight buzzed overhead, illuminating the lot in a stark glow that revealed no trace of the bullies. As though their earlier hostility had dissolved into the night air, the moment real solidarity had stepped in. Mark gave Sarah a nod through his windshield, and she slowly pulled out, guiding her car toward the parking lot exit, while he eased in behind her, determined to keep her within view all the way to her home. The tires whispered across the wet pavement, and in that quiet hum, he found a strange sense of peace, an understanding that sometimes, even in an age of cynicism, people could rise above their fears to protect one another. Streetlights flickered over them as they navigated through modest neighborhoods, each lamppost reflecting off Sarah's taillights and serving as a small beacon in the darkness, a stepping stone on their journey from conflict to safety. Mark felt his mind wandering to thoughts of what lay ahead for Sarah. In the best-case scenario, She would never have to see those three men again. But if she did, perhaps the memory of tonight's collective stand would help her find the courage to resist them. Driving with uncharacteristic caution, he realized the sense of purpose that flooded him whenever he took on the role of protector, far surpassing any satisfaction he had felt from hitting blockbuster box office numbers. He wondered if the bullies were drifting through the same streets at that moment, their anger roiling in search of a fresh target, or if they had chosen to retreat and nurse their wounded pride in private. That uncertainty, thick with the possibility of future confrontation, kept him alert as each turn in the road brought them closer to the sanctuary of Sarah's driveway. Finally, after a few miles of weaving through suburban roads, they arrived at her modest home. A single-story house with peeling paint, a well-worn porch swing, and a small yard strewn with toddler toys, each piece reflecting the humble reality of her struggle. Mark parked behind her, stepping out just as she was unbuckling her seatbelt, and in the cool hush of the evening, they exchanged a moment of silent relief that neither of the bullies' vehicles had followed. Sarah popped open her trunk, and Mark joined her, helping carry the groceries up the short path to her front door while a solitary porch light flickered, exposing a threadbare doormat emblazoned with the word, "Welcome." Even as fatigue weighed on both of them, a quiet determination still shone in their eyes, underscoring that fear may linger, but resolve would guide them forward, a testament to the resilience they had found in each other. Sarah balanced the door key in a shaking hand before sliding it into the lock, offering Mark a timid invitation to come inside for a moment, perhaps as a way to further distance herself from the lingering shadows of the night. Once in the living room, its decor a mix of second-hand furniture and bright child-friendly posters, he gently set down the bags, resisting the urge to fuss over the chipped coffee table or the thick stack of unpaid bills peeking out from an old cookie jar. Sarah's embarrassment at her home's condition was evident in her eyes, but Mark's expression held only understanding, memories of his own family's modest beginnings softening any impulse to judge. She opened the can of formula with great care, verifying the brand and size, as if reconfirming that this necessary resource was truly hers after all the tumult, a tangible reminder of what they had fought for back in the store. Mark lingered by the door, uncertain how to say goodbye, aware that though their chance meeting might have seemed fleeting, the bond forged in adversity carried a weight that neither of them could dismiss. She confessed that she felt safer just knowing he had walked this far with her, that maybe her nightmares would be a bit less haunting tonight because someone had finally stood with her instead of passing by. He offered a small but genuine smile, suggesting that if she ever needed anything, she could reach out, and though he couldn't promise his schedule would always permit personal assistance, he would try to help in any way possible. She teared up again, this time touched by the kindness in his words, and admitted that even a single phone call or text would mean the world when things felt overwhelming. A spark of an idea crossed Mark's mind. Perhaps he could connect her with some local community resources or charitable foundations, leveraging his network to ensure she wouldn't always have to scrape by in lonely desperation. Sarah looked taken aback at the suggestion but nodded, momentarily speechless, realizing she had been granted an opportunity few in her position ever received, and a window of hope cracked open in her otherwise stressful life. Mark, noticing her exhaustion, decided not to overstay his welcome, quietly excusing himself so she could settle in for the night without having to entertain a houseguest in these emotionally charged circumstances. At the door, they exchanged a final glance that carried a universe of unspoken gratitude, shared courage and mutual respect, as though acknowledging that while life might throw more trials their way, tonight they had at least conquered one. Stepping out into the cool darkness again, Mark felt the leftover adrenaline begin to ebb, replaced by a reflective calm and a sense of personal growth he hadn't anticipated when he first wandered into the grocery store earlier that evening. The door clicked shut behind him, and he gazed up at the stars for a moment, humbled by the magnitude of fate's subtle workings, which had drawn him into Sarah's life at precisely the right moment to make a meaningful difference. As he returned to his car, the memory of the bully's scowls still hovered in the back of his mind, but he felt more resolute than ever that such cruelty was only powerful when good people refused to stand against it. Sliding behind the wheel, he made a silent vow to leverage whatever influence he possessed to encourage compassion, solidarity, and empathy, hoping that if more people emulated those values, the world might see fewer incidents like the one that had unfolded this evening. He started the engine, letting out a long exhale, and began the drive back to his own residence, noticing how the headlights illuminated the quiet suburban streets now devoid of the menacing figures that had loomed in his mind. Though tomorrow might bring headlines or social media chatter about Mark Wahlberg's run-in at a local grocery store, he realized he cared less about the publicity and more about the lesson it might impart, that a single act of courage could alter the trajectory of someone's life. He resolved to check in on Sarah soon, even if only via a phone call, to make sure she hadn't suffered any further intimidation and to see whether she needed help connecting with charities or local programs for single parents. Meanwhile, he suspected that the ringleader and his cronies might stew in their anger, but maybe, just maybe, witnessing an entire community stand against their cruelty would sow a seed of self-reflection in their hardened hearts. Though he harbored no illusions that deep-rooted behavior changed overnight, he clung to the belief that moments of clarity could emerge when people realized they could not tyrannize others without consequence. Driving under the hush of streetlights, Mark found a sense of renewed purpose beating within him, as though his own childhood experiences had converged with this night's events, forging a deeper commitment to shield those who lacked a protector. He thought again of Sarah's trembling form in the checkout line, how her tears had given way to resolve once she sensed he and others would stand by her side, and the memory filled him with quiet satisfaction. In the rearview mirror, the streetlights receded, and with them, the lingering shadows of the bullies' threats, replaced by the promise of a fresh day on the horizon and the knowledge that courage could sprout in even the most unlikely places. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the tension in his shoulders had softened, replaced by a profound gratitude for all the strangers who had come together. Elderly shoppers, a timid security guard, a college student, and reminded him that decency often prevailed when it truly mattered. He parked and sat there for a few moments, reflecting on how one spontaneous decision had morphed into a saga of conflict, solidarity, and personal growth, its impact rippling far beyond the walls of that unassuming grocery store. In the soft glow of his porch light, he climbed out of his car, already planning what he might do next. Perhaps donate to a local shelter, maybe volunteer at an outreach program, or simply keep his eyes open for the next opportunity to make a difference. His last conscious thought before he locked up and turned in for the night was that, despite the bullies' malice and the fear they had spread, tonight's real story was about empathy, kindness, and the promise that neither Sarah nor Mark was truly alone.